Hi, hello, welcome. This is Let's Talk About Myths, baby, and I am your host, Liv. Back once again, looking at some of the many episodes I have done in the past on LGBTQIA characters that can be so reasonably and righteously read as queer from the ancient world. And today I am incredibly excited to bring you stories of boyfriends because, of course, as I've talked about so many times, we are really lacking in stories of queer women in the ancient world, but we have a wealth of queer men. And that is because it was, to an extent, socially acceptable. It was socially acceptable to have sex with men, particularly in Athens. There are so many rules and regulations about what made it okay, lots of who is the penetrator and who is the penetrated, and what that means, because you know that latter is going to be more like a woman. Real trouble there, weak. Can you tell I'm sarcastic, right? Yeah. And so we have so many stories of heroes and regular people who had male lovers. And it's very exciting. It's nice to have these stories. There is, of course, a lot of problematizing because of the types of relationships that were standard in particularly ancient Athens. Again, but of course, the mythology goes so far beyond that tradition. But today's episode, I am bringing you a conversation or part of a conversation I had last year with Charlotte Gregory, who was so much fun. Charlotte and I had so much fun to the point where I was re-listening to this just to clip out some pieces for today. And I was like, oh no, I've got to talk to her again because that was such a joy. And I'm sure we could record another amazing episode of the show. But until that time, we have part of that episode. And of course, Charlotte is the person who is doing, I believe it's PhD or MA, regardless, heavy research into Achilles and Patroclus, but particularly Achilles and Patroclus as they are depicted in reception today. So this bit of the episode features us talking about how Achilles and Patroclus are presented in Troy, the movie Troy, with a little bit of an aside into the argument that existed in classical Athens and which is documented. An argument, and again, it's a fictionalized conversation, but representative of a very real conversation that would have been happening just amongst people, because there was a debate in classical Athens about basically who was the Erastes, who was the Eromenos in the relationship between Achilles and Patroclus. This is the problematizing stuff. We're going to look at that. I'm going to replay not only Charlotte's conversation where that kind of gets brought up, but then the episodes I did that actually break down what that was and what the argument was, because it appears in Plato's Symposium. So I'm going to play you some moments from those episodes on Plato's Symposium. But again, that is a 2-part episode that I did, and it is bananas. It is the origin of the concept of soulmates, right? It's where we get this sort of bizarre philosophizing about soulmates through a fictionalized Aristophanes, where they look at like people being separated and looking for their other half, except that basically this entire conversation is a big conversation about love. That's where that comes in. It's where Achilles and Patroclus comes in, but it's really heavily just about love between men. And then like every once in a while, they're like, I guess sometimes men love women too, but it's really entertaining. And so I'm sharing part of that episode as well. But again, the 2-part episode and all of these episodes are available in the Spotify playlist that is linked in the episode's description. And then following that, I just thought we're on a run with important heroes who had beloved boyfriends. And so I am sharing a bit of last year's episode where I redid the stories of Heracles and his many boyfriends, where I basically found every record of anyone who ever mentioned Heracles with a man and like played them all out. And so we're going to look at that. And just this reminder again that they, in the ancient world, they really did respect love between men. Of course, it had its limits. It was, not about getting married or like necessarily long-term companionship, but it's really interesting the way that this existed in the ancient world and then the way that it has been like subsequently forgotten or ignored in favor of like the Christian notions of heterosexuality and nonsense. So just fascinating to look back. So please sit back and enjoy the heroes and their boyfriends. This is episode 265, the beloved boyfriends of Greek mythology's most famous heroes.
A homoerotic reading of Troy and how they're clearly trying to suppress this queer reading, but they cannot. It still creeps through, which is fun to sort of analyze.
Yeah, I noticed that in a rewatch of 300 recently too, which is from like the same time period, and they do the same thing where it's like, and you know, it's the mid 2000s. Like I feel like I also, like, I was a teenager and I just have such a grasp on like what it was like back then, and you can kind of like see you can just like, you know exactly why and how everything happened the way that it did, especially compared to now, which is sort of fascinating. But both of them are these like super heterosexual, like absolutely no queerness. They're just getting rid of it entirely. And then, yeah, like you said, like can't actually fully get rid of it because the gaze is like there really heavily.
It comes down to the gaze. So part of my thesis, I'm looking at the idea of the male gaze. And one of the issues of films like Troy is they are these masculine film genres aimed predominantly at male audiences, but they have the male body on display. And that's inherently kind of, it causes these problems for the audience because you have men looking at the male body as this, because Brad Pitt in Troy is definitely meant to be an object of desire. I mean, it's Brad Pitt. He was world's sexiest man twice. He's only like 4 celebrities have ever had that title. That's what he's known for. And so when you have a male audience watching this, they have to then come up with these techniques to try and suppress sort of the queerness of men watching other men and their bodies. And so that's why you get Briseis, you get those, the first scene where he's naked in bed with 2 women, not 1, 2. That's how, like, he's so heterosexual and manly. And it plays into this image of him almost as like a rock star figure, like sleeping around. He's so good at what he does. I love it, but it still creeps through. They've got him in the shortest skirt possible. And yes, and the scenes with Patroclus, it still creeps through. Like when he introduces Odysseus to Patroclus, and the way he does it is he holds Patroclus by the wrists, so both wrists in one hand, and he holds a sword to his back and pushes him. So Patroclus has kind of presented to Odysseus with his chest out. And firstly, I was like, okay, well, you know, kind of kinky holding him by the wrist. The sword at the back is obviously phallic. And the way he's positioned made me really think of these paintings of Saint Sebastian where he's bound with his wrist behind and he's always got his chest out. And then that Saint Sebastian thing carries through to the end when Achilles is killed by multiple arrows. And Saint Sebastian is, what was it? A friend said to me, he's the patron saint of twinks, is how he described him. So it's pretty queer.
I love these. I've never like, it's been a long time since I've watched Troy. Unfortunately, I also do want to like kind of, I might mention this in the introduction too, but like obviously there's unfortunately a lot of shit around Brad Pitt now. He seems like he's kind of a super problematic piece of garbage. So I just want to like recognize that I know that, but also, you know, we can and should still talk about Troy. Yeah.
Yeah, it's one of those things I've been wondering about whether to sort of discuss that in the thesis, because I'm talking about his star image a lot and what that brought to the role and how that influences people's perceptions of Achilles and his masculinity and sexuality. So I've been a bit umming and ahhing over whether to add a thing, sort of a disclaimer, because it does sound like I'm praising him nonstop in my thesis, being like, world's sexiest man. He had two most beautiful women. He's in all these major roles and all this sort of stuff. And I kind of want to be like, I'm not saying he's a good person. There's a lot going on, but I'm not sure if it bears relevance to my thesis because it is from 2004 and 5 I'm really talking about.
Well, and I mean, 2004 and 5 Brad Pitt is such a different person. Like, obviously, he's still kind of got everything around him. So, and we won't, I don't want to like dwell on that. I just want to make sure I said it and didn't pretend like I didn't know. But like 2004, 2005 Brad Pitt was like a time in itself. Like, I grew up watching Friends all of the time, and for the longest time, my favorite episode to rewatch is when he is on. It's the best episode. It's just like between him and Jennifer Aniston, and then the Angelina Jolie of it all, which had to have been happening around that time.
It is. So at the time that Troy came out, that was in May 2004, and that is when the rumors started about him and Angelina. So it's very relevant to my sort of analysis of Achilles' masculinity and sexuality, because it kind of plays into this whole him as this playboy figure, seducing women, getting all these beautiful women. And that really then people are going to be with their minds going into them watch Brad Pitt play Achilles, and they're going to have this in the back of their mind, because I don't think you can watch him in Troy and not think that's Brad Pitt. You don't watch and go Achilles, you think that's Brad Pitt.
Yeah, I mean, it was like the height of his career, and for him to play that role. To bring it back to the Patroclus, because I've never registered how he's presented to Odysseus. That's fascinating. I need to rewatch this, not least because I love Odysseus and Sean Bean as Odysseus, I should say. I like to interchange the two. They're basically the same person. But the Patroclus of it all is also so interesting because of how they frame him. So like, I know there are arguments to be made that technically Patroclus can be seen as Achilles' cousin in the mythology. I don't think that takes away from the fact that they were in a relationship. Like, it's Greek mythology. Everyone's related. Persephone's uncle, or Hades is Persephone's uncle on both sides, is the thing I like to remind everyone.
I didn't realize it was that bad.
Yep. Like, literally, he's their uncle, mother and father. Great times. But so, it doesn't matter that they were cousins. But in Troy, the cousin is like emphasized so much, and I've always taken that as that really strong, like, we're not gay, he's my cousin. He's also like considerably younger. He's very like that whole vibe, and then positioning Brad Pitt, the two women thing. I've never thought of it in that way, of like just being like, we're starting out with a bang, this man is straight, you guys.
Exactly. It is, because it is the first time we see him, and then Patroclus is his younger cousin, and again, like you said, and there's lots of people, when I posted about, were they cousins or not on Twitter, people very quick to say, does it even matter? And I'm like, no, I'm not saying it actually mattered for ancient people, but I'm saying that in Troy, it's not actually quite right. And it now means that a lot of people now think that's what their relationship was. Like, I was at dinner with friends last night, and I mentioned I was going to do this podcast and talk about their relationship. And one person immediately went, oh, well, they were cousins. And I was like, oh my God, it's happening. So I had to then kind of explain, it varies according to the different genealogies, but it's only in Hesiod's Theogony that we have this, like, the genealogy has them as first cousins. Usually they're sort of distant, which again, though, doesn't actually matter for an ancient, Zeus and Hera. Like, no one really cared back then. But it's clearly appealing to like modern tastes and sensibilities, to be like, this is another preventative measure to sort of add this barrier between them and a homoerotic reading. And and then the multiple women, having him younger as well is really interesting, because in all mythological he's older. He's the older of the two. It's explicitly stated in the Iliad and later sources, which then causes a whole load of issues for later Greek writers.
The work in question today is, once again, Plato's Symposium. As when I talked about Atlantis, we're not to take this work as suggesting that this conversation actually took place, but instead that Plato is using this fictional conversation between real men to present his theories, his philosophies, his ideas. Now, I won't pretend like I know even remotely enough about Plato and his work to tell you all what he's actually intending in the depths of this dialogue. I am, after all, someone who specializes in the mythology. Instead, what I'm going to do is just tell you what's included in this dialogue, because not only does it feature a number of mythological characters that we care a lot about, but also names that you'll know and hopefully love from past episodes of the show. It's mythology adjacent, anyway, because it uses a number of these very famous mythological characters to speak to this notion of not only other halves, but love generally, and a lot of love between men. Fictionalized version of the real men who were taking part in this conversation. Firstly, a man named Phaedrus, who features in other Platonic dialogues. He's an Athenian aristocrat and close pals with Socrates, the philosopher, who also features, because this is Plato, and so of course he does. Then we have a man named Pausanias, not to be confused with the source Pausanias. Then Aristophanes, gods, do we know him well, and Agathon. Agathon was a tragic playwright of the time, though his work doesn't survive for us today. He was also, it seems, pretty openly what we would now call gay. It's his party, his symposium, that they're speaking at together. There's also Eryximachus, a physician, and then there's Alcibiades. An Athenian politician and orator. He is extremely important historically. He features heavily in Assassin's Creed Odyssey in the most entertaining of ways. And he was eventually exiled from Athens after being accused of sneaking around in the dead of night and shipping off all of the penises from all of the herms around town and stealing them. That's Alcibiades. And then, finally, there's also Aristodemos. He's the one telling the story, though through a roundabout way that I won't bother explaining. There are others there too, but I'm not going to bog you down with unnecessary names. These are the voices that we are concerned with today. And the conversation that these men have at this drinking party is all about love, eros. Both the god and the concept, the very idea of love as it exists among gods and humans and everyone in between. But before they really dive into the love of it all, they have to discuss how exactly they plan to drink. And while I had originally planned to just jump right into their relevant conversation, this bit is a bit too relatable. Once they've finished eating their dinner all together, Pausanias turns to the group and he says, quote, "Well, gentlemen, what's the most undemanding way to do our drinking? I can tell you that I'm in a really bad state from yesterday's drinking and need a rest. I think that's true of many of you as you were there yesterday. So think about how to do our drinking in the most undemanding way." They're seriously hungover and they want to take it easy. After some talk of the intricacies of their forthcoming night of drinking and excess of wine, the conversation does finally turn to what concerns us. Love. We learn that Phaedrus is often concerned with with love, with how the poets neglect the god and the concept of love, and thus, why don't they all now give speeches on the topic of love, in praise of love, while they sip endless amounts of wine? Phaedrus begins by saying, quote, "that love was regarded by humans and gods as a great and awesome god for many reasons, especially his origin." He's speaking here of big love, that one I've told you about, the version of Eros that is primordial, who was born from the chaos itself, who has no true parents and just exists. Phaedrus goes, quote, "I would claim that there is no great benefit for a young man than a good lover, and none greater for a lover than a good boyfriend." And thus, we're getting to the root of this conversation right at the top. While the idea of love between a man and a woman will come up briefly, the concern from jump is that of men with other men. Still, the ultimate concern at this point in the speeches is the broader idea of love. So Phaedrus goes on to talk about how love is the greatest motivator that there is. Nothing else provides such guidance to humans on how to lead good lives. Surely a man who does something disgraceful, cowardly, would be more disturbed to have such acts witnessed by his boyfriend than his father or his friends. He says the same applies to the boyfriend. It would be his lover's opinion that was most important. And, quote, if there was any mechanism for producing a city or army consisting of lovers and boyfriends, there could be no better form of social organization than this. Which is just a good quote. Just like a city, an army of men who love each other. But particularly because Thebes does exactly this with their famed sacred band. They were a band of warriors that were so effective that they were actually basically what Sparta wished they were. And they were all lovers, buried together in death. Turns out it actually did work just as well as Phaedrus suggested. And then, finally, Phaedrus shifts to include women in his narrative about love. It's true for women as well as men, he adds after a long and detailed examination on the devotion between lovers and their boyfriends. His example is none other than Alcestis, whose story I told through Euripides' play by the same name, and gods, is that a good play? Alcestis famously died for her husband, even when his parents refused to die for him. Phaedrus explains that the gods recognized Alcestis' sacrifice, how her love for her husband outweighed everything else, because they allowed her to return to the land of the living, something almost no other person had been granted. Even Orpheus, he goes on to explain, wasn't granted the same. They only showed him a phantom of his wife because he didn't have the courage to actually die in her place like Alcestis did. He entered the underworld still alive, thus not proving himself to the degree that true love requires. True love, it seems, requires entire sacrifice. But returning once more to the obviously more important love between men, at least according to these men, Phaedrus speaks of none other than Achilles and Patroclus. Achilles, you see, was willing to die for Patroclus. Phaedrus recounts that Achilles knew from the words of his mother Thetis that if he went after Hector, if he killed Hector, he would die himself. And if he let Hector live, he would go on to live a long and happy life. None of that mattered to Achilles, though, after the death of Patroclus. Quote, he had the courage to choose to act on behalf of his lover by avenging him. He not only died for him, but also died as well as him, since Patroclus was already dead. This, Phaedrus explains in his speech, won him all the honors the gods could bestow. He proved how much he loved Patroclus and was gifted with an afterlife on the Isle of the Blessed in return for this sacrifice. Phaedrus' speech shifts here from reverence for the love of Achilles and Patroclus, Achilles' sacrifice of his own life after the death of Patroclus, to a jab at none other than Aeschylus. Aeschylus, who was long dead by the time of this fictional conversation, but absolutely famous as all hell. Apparently, he wrote into one of his plays that Achilles was the lover, the elder of the two, and that Patroclus was the younger one, the boyfriend. Phaedrus notes how wrong this is because Homer made it so clear that Achilles was younger, was more beautiful than Patroclus, and that he was actually the most beautiful hero overall. This means he has to have been the boyfriend. He says that, of course, Aeschylus's version was nonsense because Achilles was beardless and younger than Patroclus, obviously. Which is when I must pause to address the elephant in the room, the overarching theme that's being discussed here when referring to men in relationships with other men, lovers and boyfriends, as they're calling them, and that is pederasty. I've talked about this in passing, often with guests, but it's deeply relevant here. Many ancient Greeks, particularly around this time period and heavily in Athens specifically, practiced pederasty, also referred to as an Erastes-Eromenos relationship. These were relationships between an older man, the Erastes, and a much younger man or boy, the Eromenos. That's what Phaedrus is referring to in his speech. All of this, the lover, boyfriend, the lover is the Erastes, the boyfriend is the Eromenos. That's just how they're translated here as lover and boyfriend, but the power dynamic is obvious in all of his phrasing. That's what Phaedrus is complaining about in regards to Aeschylus's version of Achilles and Patroclus. Aeschylus suggests that Achilles was the Erastes, the lover, and Patroclus was the Eromenos, the boyfriend. Phaedrus, you see, is confident that this is nonsense and that Achilles was, indeed, the Eromenos, and that fact only heightened his importance and the gifts the gods gave him in death. There's a lot of debate as to what this type of relationship looked like in real life and just how troubling we might see it now, and I don't want to suggest that I know nearly enough to comment on the intricacies. Obviously, today, it's horrifying, but the point is that it really was a common practice. The Erastes man was older, he was established, and the Eromenos was younger, sometimes around puberty. Basically, the point being that he didn't yet have a beard. They were particularly concerned with beards. Obviously, we, again, see a relationship like this now, and there are, red flags everywhere, alarms blaring in the distance. But while it's definitely got an ick factor, it was something practiced and understood to be a normal and loving relationship that benefited both parties in the ancient world. Apparently, there might have been laws around age and consent, too, so that's nice. And we should remember that while the age thing sounds gross, and it is, but the age at which girls and young women would marry older men was about the same. So it wasn't gender specific in terms of age, and just generally, an ancient world with entirely different morals than our own. We won't try to dwell too long on this factor, because that's just not fun. Ultimately, and this is something that's going to come up a lot in Friday's conversation, which is all about Achilles and Patroclus, the idea of an Erastes-Eromenos relationship when it comes to those two is a bit silly, because almost certainly the stories of the Iliad were developed long before that was a tradition, which truly only serves to make the debate about who played which role, which again amounts to basically who was the top and who was the bottom, just irrelevant. It doesn't matter. Just don't tell those men at the symposium that, because they feel very strongly. Regardless, Phaedrus finishes his speech by emphasizing the sacrifice of both Alcestis and Achilles when it comes to love. Though it's Achilles who wins out. He sacrificed more, and so he was rewarded with more for his love of Patroclus. And thus, here is your official ancient Greek sourcing that confirms that Achilles and Patroclus were seen as lovers in the ancient Greek world. And good, big, huge, important lovers at that. Ones that philosophers would just philosophize about. They had the kind of love that surpasses everything, that overcomes anything in its path, that even the gods look upon with envy and respect. If Heracles is anything, it's a slut. Okay, maybe that's harsh, I'm not slut-shaming, but it seems like a good opener, There's nothing wrong with being a slut. Heracles can do it, so can you. Let's take back the word, it's a fun one. The point is that during his many mythological stories, Heracles had sex with absolutely countless people. Just hundreds. For real, hundreds. many women, many men. The dude just got around. And there's a reason for that, and it wasn't an addiction to sex, though let's not blame him for his desires, you know? The reason why Heracles slept with everyone and their mother is because, well, he's Heracles. Unlike the other major Greek heroes, Heracles spanned the entirety of the Greek world. He was regional, sure, he had ties to Thebes and the Peloponnese, but unlike heroes like Theseus and Cadmus, even Perseus, Heracles was the hero for all of Greece. It's why he's so famous and why there are so many stories tied to him. Because in order to be on the ancient Greek map, so to speak, you had to have some kind of tie to Heracles. And often the easiest way to do that was through him having had sex with someone from your town or your region. Thus, we get these hundreds of stories of Heracles having sex with people all around the Greek world. But today is about some very specific people that were varying degrees of special in Heracles' life, have varying degrees of information associated with them. We are talking about his boyfriends, because yeah, he had a lot of them. A lot. And we'll start with the most beautiful man ever to live. Sexy, sexy Adonis, the man famous for being so beautiful that Aphrodite and Persephone fought over who would get to be with him. He was also said to have been a lover of Heracles. And speaking of beautiful men, Nereus was a king of Simi. Anyway, Nereus was super fucking gorgeous. Some authors refer to him as the second most beautiful of all the Greeks to sail to Troy, second only to Achilles, so you know that he was hot shit. Anyway, we have literally no information about their relationship except to say that apparently Nereus was loved by Heracles. And then there's a man named Abderos, who was, according to some, a son of Hermes and a nymph named Thronia. He was a squire or a groom to Heracles, a young man helping him with his labors, at least with the labor that entailed the man-eating mares of Diomedes, where this poor young man, Abderos, was killed by those mares, torn apart. So I suppose their romance was short-lived. And one of the most thrilling references to lovers of Heracles is none other than Nestor himself. Now, is this found in a vague and very late reference? Yes. But it's Nestor and Heracles together. It's too fun to criticize the source. You see, according to Philostratus, a 3rd century CE writer, Heracles once fell for none other than the famous king of Pylos, Nestor. Philostratus says that when Heracles met Nestor, he found him to be quite appealing, handsome even, and that he cherished him more than so many of his other past lovers, specifically because unlike the other men that Heracles tended to be with, Nestor wasn't young and innocent. He wasn't untested. No. Nestor had seen things, he was mature, and few did Heracles like that about him. Honestly, huge respect to Heracles for this one. I mean, Nestor was almost certainly the silver fox of the ancient Greek heroes. Corythus was a nice man that was said to be a lover of Heracles. I'm just assuming he was nice, actually, because literally all we know is that he was an Iberian man who was loved by Heracles, and apparently he also made the first helmet. So, that was nice for him. And then, of course, there's Iolaus, who was famous for being Heracles' charioteer and for helping him vitally in his slaying of the Lernaean Hydra. Without Iolaus on that one, Heracles would have been well and truly fucked, and Iolaus was also most well known as Heracles' nephew, but according to Plutarch at least, they were also lovers. Whether that version has him as the nephew and the lover of Heracles isn't entirely clear. We're going to go with the idea that if and when they're seen as lovers, they're also not, uncle and nephew. But then this is Greek mythology, so anything goes. According to a 3rd century poet named Alcaius, Heracles loved a fellow by the name of Polystratus, who was likely also called by the name Sostratus, and when that man died, Heracles was so distraught that he cut his hair in grief, something typically done by women in their grief. Heracles was nothing if not devoted, even if he had quite the volume of men to be devoted to. All the same, that still lines up with everything there is about Heracles. As much as everyone all across Greece wanted him to be part of their local mythos, more often than not they gave him a lover, man or woman, from their region too. It results in a man that seems to have gotten around pretty prolifically, but also loved equally deeply. A very late source has this wild-ass line to share about another lover of Heracles. Quote, Stichios, the Aetolian, who was beloved by Heracles, was opened and found to have a hairy heart. He had been killed by Heracles himself when, in his madness, he killed his own children, and it is said that he was the only one the hero lamented. Yeah, you heard me. According to this random dude, Photius, from the 8th century CE, Heracles loved a guy named Stichios, who had a hairy heart? Sorry, what exactly? And then I guess Heracles killed him accidentally at the same time that he killed his wife Megara and their 2 children. But according to this weirdo source, Heracles only felt bad about killing this Stichios man? Absolutely wild-ass nonsense that definitely isn't found in any Greek sources from the ancient Greek world. But gods, was it funny, and funny enough that it had to be shared with you all today. And speaking of obscure and weird sources, a scholiast on Apollodorus, i.e. someone from the vaguely ancient world breaking down an ancient work, says that Heracles had many other lovers, including Philoctetes, Pirithous, and no, I'm not sure if that's meant to be Theseus's Pirithous. It's possible. A man named Diomos, and another named Phrix. So, those are more possible lovers, I suppose, though I can't find any references to anything more. And then, most importantly, and told in the most detail, we have none other than Heracles' beloved Hylas. Nerds, thank you all so much for listening. I really love to be able to reshare these and just look back and revisit them myself. And honestly, every time I'm trying to imagine ways that I can, keep doing these narrative episodes for Pride every year. But even if I can't, I still have conversations. I'm going to have so many. It's, it really is a wealth of topics when it comes to this, and more all the time, because now it's normal to study queer relationships in the ancient world. So there is going to be no lack of content for next year. And until then, enjoy the conversations that I'm bringing you about queerness in the ancient world. I fucking love them. Let's Talk About Myths, Baby is written and produced by me, Liv Albert. Michaela Smith is the Hermes to my Olympians, my assistant producer. Laura Smith is the production assistant and audio engineer. Select music in this episode was by Luke Chaos. Listen on Spotify or Apple or wherever you get your podcasts. I am Liv, and I love this shit.